All right, Rabbi say good morning. Let us begin. So I just want to we're going to actually try to get started on the daf a few moments early this morning. As Baruch Hashem, we have a lot to do. So but I wanted just to spend a few minutes tying up this piece that we started yesterday in the Mesilos B'Ohr Ha'Chassidus. So if you remember again, the Mechaber here introduced us to the idea as brought down in the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, of Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi, who introduced the concept that when it comes to galus, there are two different types of galus, two different types of exile. There's galus hanefesh and galus haguf, or maybe better stated, galus haguf and galus hanefesh. There's exile of the body and exile of the soul, or displacement of the body, displacement of the soul. When we think about galus, of course, again, we are most familiar with the concept of galus haguf, physical displacement. I'm not where I am supposed to be. I'm exiled to somewhere else. But the Rebbe pointed out that galus hanefesh, the displacement of the soul, is really the most profound and traumatic type of galus. And the Rebbe went on to explain that really galus haguf, physical displacement or physical exile, is the result of galus hanefesh, of spiritual exile or displacement. So we left off on page 176, the last paragraph on the bottom, that's on the right-hand side of the page. Amnam, Tsaros haguf v'hashibot hakasha hishkichu mehem es matzavam hanafshi hashefa v'anidach. The challenge of what happened in Mitzrayim, of what happened in Egypt, is that the physical suffering was so intense that it had eclipsed the spiritual displacement, which I will say is not an uncommon situation, in general in life. So it's interesting. People think that when one is suffering, that is the time to find God. But the truth is, any person who has undergone physical suffering knows that when you are in the midst of a physical difficulty, sometimes it takes all of your emotional wherewithal, your emotional strength, just to be able to keep your head above water. That very often when people are suffering, they do not have the bandwidth to find God. That's why it's so important. The time to cultivate the relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam is not in crisis. It's when things are calm, and because when crisis hits, often it just takes all of your koach just to be able to weather the crisis. So what happened to Klal Yisrael in Mitzrayim? The physical suffering was so overwhelming. The physical galus itself was so overwhelming that there was no bandwidth to address the spiritual displacement. There was no time to think about the Ruchni. We'll say, think about this. The Egyptians are throwing the Jewish babies into the Nile, right? We're working like beasts of burden. There's no time, there's no bandwidth to be able to focus on the galus haruchni, on the spiritual displacement, the spiritual exile. And therefore, again, essentially, the neshama becomes forgotten. Therefore, the Toldos Yaakov Yosef points to something very interesting. During 210 years of servitude, you never hear once Klal Yisrael ever daven for the galus hapnimi, for the galus hanafshi. They never once daven regarding their spiritual exile or their spiritual displacement. Asher al yada yigalu memela megalus yachisonas. Interestingly enough, remember, the Toldos Yaakov Yosef's entire idea is that there is this interconnectedness between galus hanefesh and galus haguf. Right? Spiritual exile, physical exile. To the point that he says that physical exile is a result of spiritual exile. Now I will say from a historical perspective, we know this to be true. Leaving out Mitzrayim, because Mitzrayim is an interesting aside. But if you think about it, the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and its exile, the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash and its exile, physical galus, physical displacement, comes as a result of spiritual galus. And as we pointed out yesterday, one could be spiritually exiled even before they're geographically exiled. So the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed and galus occurred because we experienced galus nafshi, galus panimi. We were spiritually displaced, and therefore as a result, we were physically displaced. So the converse is also true, that if you're able to go ahead and remedy your galus nafshi, your spiritual exile, then by definition what happens afterwards? Physical exile is immediately remedied as well. So when Klal Yisrael is overwhelmed by the enormity of their circumstances, the approach should have been, let's remedy our spiritual exile. Let's go ahead and work on our ruchnius. If we remedy the galus hanefesh, then by definition, the galus haguf will be taken care of as well. But they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? Because once again, they were so overwhelmed by their circumstances, so profoundly overwhelmed by their circumstances, that they could not even think about their nefesh. They couldn't even think about their souls. Rabbi Gemara says, Ella, hispalalu rak al hagalos hachitzonis. All they davened for, and it's not even so much that they davened, but all they focused on, ultimately again, was their physical servitude, was their physical galus, their physical displacement. Kirnimaz b'psukim, as the pasuk says, Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avoda vayizaku. Let's say, remember, right? Why do they cry out? They cried out because of the backbreaking labor, which of course is understandable. But what the Toldos Yaakov Yosef is pointing out of it, which is so profound, is Klal Yisrael were so overwhelmed by their physical circumstances that they gave no thought to the spiritual exile. And the irony of that is that it was the spiritual exile, or remedying the spiritual exile, that was the key to remedying the physical exile. Yet again, no thought was given to that. Even HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I've heard their cries because of their taskmasters. I've heard their cries because of their taskmasters. So again, you see even the Ribono Shel Olam, when he doesn't, they're not crying out of us. I want to point out over here, many of the Mefarshim even point out that when it says, Vayanchu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avoda means some. You see, we often translate that as tefillah. Vayizaku means za'aka tefillah. Many of the commentaries on Chumash point out they weren't even davening. They were just crying out in pain. Not even crying out in pain to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just crying out in pain. They were just ultimately, again, in pain, and so there was like a reflexive reaction to cry out in difficulty. So I'll say a really incredible yesod, highlighting the idea, the interconnectedness between galus hanefesh, galus haguf, and if only we would remedy the galus hanefesh, then ultimately, again, the galus haguf would come. Such an incredible yesod. We'll say what it also does is, it puts in our hands the reins to geula. If you want geula, geula comes when we remedy our galus hanefesh. Then galus haguf occurs. Now, Bosi, he goes on 171. We're going to stop here for today, but he goes on 171 to discuss. Now you begin to see the incredible profundity of Yitzias Mitzrayim. What was so unique about Geulas Mitzrayim? It's that although we did not take the proper steps for Geula, right? The way this was supposed to work was we take care of the Galus HaNefesh or Galus Pnimi, and then Galus HaGuf comes. HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought about Geula, even though we did not take the necessary steps. We'll stop over here. We'll pick up with the rest of this on Monday. But again, just food for thought about this notion of Galus HaNefesh. I've been very taken by this concept of Toldos Yaakov Yosef since I saw it a few days ago, which is this notion of am I in a state of spiritual exile? Where is my nefesh holding? Am I spiritually redeemed? Or ultimately, again, am I in Galus HaNefesh? And if I'm Galus HaNefesh, then ultimately, what steps am I taking to remedy that spiritual exile? All right, so we'll stop here. We'll pick up on Monday with some more.